Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. Today I'm talking to Laura Deitz, an American lady living in London who's been working as a volunteer since the collapse of the Republic of Afghanistan to get vulnerable women out of the country to safety. She's helped more than 300 people so far, all the while juggling her own work and family life. She has 4 young daughters, one of them a newborn when the crisis began. She's the embodiment of the saying that if you want something done, ask a busy woman. Have a listen.
I was born and raised in the state of Kansas in the United States, which many of your listeners may not know where that is. It's right in the center and often affectionately referred to as flyover country. Came to the UK as a university student with my husband, and we've more or less stayed outside the United States ever since. Most of our time has been spent in the UK. I do have 4 incredible but very, very busy and active daughters between the ages of 11 and almost 3. And I have spent a substantial part of my adult life working as a volunteer in response to the global refugee crisis, but also serving as an advocate in various capacities for the global autism community, because that is an issue which has personally impacted my family with one of my children.
Well, let's focus then on Task Force NIX. Am I pronouncing that correctly? NYX, Task Force NIX.
You absolutely are, Lynne.
Okay, so really that's what has been occupying your volunteer work, hasn't it, since the collapse of the Afghan Republic in August 2021. Can you describe what it is, where did it grow from, and what you do with it?
Sure. So Task Force NIX is a women-led and women-centered organization that provides direct humanitarian emergency support to women in crisis in Afghanistan. Predominantly, our focus has been on women's rights activists, and even more specifically, the women's rights protesters, and we can speak about that in a moment. Over the past 2.5 years, we have supported the evacuation and ultimate resettlement of about 300 at-risk Afghans, which includes the women themselves and their family members. A key reason, and I think it's really important for people to understand, is that we were really intentional about our focus on this cohort of women. We felt, as we were observing what was taking place, that the women of Afghanistan, despite 20 years of paying lip service to them, had largely been forgotten as a part of these relocation and resettlement efforts. And we felt that that was something that we wanted to have a key role in. I work very closely with my friend Sarah. She's based in Toronto, Canada. She's also a working mother. And we have worked together in volunteer capacity in the global refugee crisis for the last 8 years through another organization.
So can you explain a little bit about what happened after the collapse of the Afghan Republic, August 15th, 2021? How did you swing into action?
I mean, it's a really important question, Lynne, because by all intents and purposes, we're both outsiders, and I would even use the word underdogs. And by that, I mean, in August 2021, when you actually were canvassing the landscape of people who were actually involved, you were seeing, understandably, a lot of military active duty personnel. You were seeing a lot of veterans with extensive and deep expertise in Afghanistan. You saw frontline civilians who are classified as people who, worked in humanitarian sectors or for NGOs. And so you saw a lot of people who had deep and personal connections to this crisis, who were sort of actively leading the charge. And, then you have me and SG who are kind of rocking up and saying, we're seeing what's happening, and, we can't literally sit back and be spectators in this. But equally, I think it's important to understand a little bit of context about who we are. So Sarah and I were on the leadership team of another US-based nonprofit that responded to the Syrian refugee crisis. And while the circumstances there were incredibly different, essentially how we built that organization was by physically presenting ourselves in Greece, networking with local organizations, and sort of building a comprehensive understanding of the landscape. A story I often like to tell is prior to my journey to Greece, things had drastically changed. And so I went on Facebook and literally found somebody had posted a Google Doc with GPS coordinates of all the refugee camps in Greece. We literally drove around in a van we had rented, rocked up to them, and used kind of diplomacy and our previous expertise to get access to these camps. And so I think those lessons very much were front of mind and foundational to us when we started to get involved. And the key thing for us was knowing very much the role that we had to play. Technology is a great tool. It can allow anyone anywhere in the world to play an active role in a crisis, but that can often come with risks where people without that expertise get involved. So, in what I call sort of phase one of evacuation and relocation efforts, which was kind of those heart wrenching scenes you were seeing on TV of people throwing their toddlers over the gates of the airport, we were really thoughtful and cautious. We knew that, we certainly weren't going to be the ones directly advising families, but there were things that we could do. So we did a lot of fundraising. We did a lot of networking. We were in contact with two specific families at that time. And I think that slow and cautious and thoughtful approach later bared many, many fruits down the line.
Mm. There's so much to unpack there, Laura. You got on the road in Greece and you physically went to refugee camps to help people find relocation in third countries. Am I right?
So the focus of that organization wasn't particularly necessarily on relocation, although there certainly were some relocate families that I did eventually support in certain capacities. But really, that organization did a lot of traditional humanitarian response. So there was one camp in northern Greece, Lynne. Our organization's colors were red. So as any good humanitarian, we had the red vest, and I clearly remember walking up to this camp and trying to like make these broad motions that we've got a van of diapers and food, and the provisions in this camp were grossly insufficient for the number of refugees that had recently arrived. He flagged us in, and I later found out he told everyone we were with the Red Cross.
Oh
So
my goodness. Yeah.
I think, again, in a very professional and thoughtful manner, there is an element in this work where you sort of fake it till you make it. And I knew that we were abiding with high levels of professionalism and integrity. But Task Force Nix, as a sort of fun aside story, when Sarah and I were originally reaching out and engaging kind of across the digital Dunkirk movement, trying to get access to, military personnel who were guiding people to the gates at the airport, to get access to getting our families on manifest lists, nobody was really responding to us. And so I made the observation we needed an organization and a brand. Task Force Nix. Nix is the Greek goddess of night. She's the daughter of chaos, and she was the only god feared by Zeus. And so that was really sort of the embodiment of the female energy we wanted to take place. I bought a domain, and one of my friends gave me a photo he had taken of a member of the Afghan Special Forces propelling out of a helicopter by like one of those little cable ropes. We put that up, and I literally cannot tell you the difference having a landing page on a website made. People started responding, they started engaging, they started making, I guess, probably, presumably, assumptions about who we are and our background and expertise. And that actually made quite a bit of difference in the early days.
But you weren't able to get in a car and go to help people in Afghanistan at that stage. So you were utilizing technology. You were hitting the phones, hitting the web, doing everything that you could online, and with this branding, drawing people to you. So a very different way of dealing with the people who you identified were in the greatest need at that time.
It is. And it's also true. I want to say, very candidly and transparently, I have never even personally been to Afghanistan, notwithstanding, what happened in August 2021. But previously, I have not. I have not been to Pakistan. But I think one of the key and important skills that you can bring to any situation is, I think, a thorough approach, but also the ability to be an active listener. So if you looked at us compared to similar organizations, while impact numbers might be similar, I think what you would actually see is most of these organizations got a whole host of people out in August 2021 and the months that followed. Whereas because we were new, because we didn't have this network of contacts and donor funding, our journey looked very different. Our resettlement really didn't take pace until much later into 2022.
So it took a while for you to cross the river feeling the stones, I guess, to paraphrase Deng Xiaoping, the great Chinese statesman of the 1980s. Uh, Tell me about how it rolled out. What date did you get started?
Well, I mean, I think all of it was important, right, Lynn? So we were working specifically supporting a good friend of my friend, Sarah, who's Task Force Next co-founder, whom I referred to as one of the key people who's been with me literally in the trenches since day one. Um, and so, that support continued. But if you really think about it, I think a lot of what we saw happen, and where missions were compromised or people were placed at enhanced vulnerability was really just a reflection of sort of the chaos and panic of the early days, which we again managed to avoid by recognizing our own experience, our own expertise. And that gave us the position to be really thoughtful. We could observe who on the ground was operating in the way that was most consistent and aligned with both kind of our principles. And then we had the opportunity to, slowly develop and build that relationship. I think a lot of people, again, would have a bit of a reaction to say, oh, this person is incredibly at risk. We need to move fast. And one of our mottos has always been one, go slow. And two, fear when it drives your decision making is one that often increases, not reduces risk.
Mm-hmm. And so what were the early days like?
Um, a lot of people not responding to me, to be quite honest with you. And I think you kind of joked at this at the future, but my experience is, we essentially hurled ourselves into brick walls. We would send hundreds of emails. We would join every single possible Zoom call. We would follow up with people. There is and there has been, and a little bit less extent today, a very vibrant online community on Signal, on Discord, on Slack. And it was literally like watching these conversations unfold in real time, coming to an understanding of who might have some relationships or expertise or access that would be beneficial to the families that we had come in contact with. And really trying to demonstrate to them why we were both sort of trustworthy and credible. So it was a lot of frustrations, because again, we didn't come into this with a number of final resettlement countries saying, oh, you're allocated 50 visas or 200 visas. It was all done purely based on, hard work and not accepting no for an answer.
But not only did you have to establish your own trustworthiness and credibility, that's a two-way street. I mean, how do you go about in a space that you're not familiar with, um, establishing the credibility of the people who are approaching you for help?
Yeah, so we now focus, as per my introduction, on the women's rights protesters in Afghanistan. And that really happened sort of serendipitously. Lynn, we have a mutual friend who introduced us to Hoda Kamouche in January 2022. We got to know her very, very well. And this was really right before, literally probably 48 hours before the slew of significant numbers of arrests of women's rights protesters. It started with Tamana Periani, Parwana Ibrahim Kill, Dr. Zara Mohammadi Haqparast, Mursal Ayar, and then there was a group of 20 in February 2022, which followed. And actually, I think it's developing deep and trusted relationships with, the women who understand the circumstances in Afghanistan and also can provide insight and information about kind of their team members. So, for example, when people are approaching us most recently, when we were doing our micro production grant scheme, one, I can recognize pretty straight off the bat which organization they work with. So I know who would have the best understanding of their role. And I think simply saying, yes, this person is a human rights defender, that's unfortunately not sufficient anymore because of the fact that donors have scaled back their programming. So we then look to cross-reference that with others who are operating in the same space. And I think cross-referencing is really important, because in this context where people's lives are at risk or they are very much dependent on donors, it is human nature to advocate in the best possible way for people that you care about. So we try to triangulate that work and that experience with, people who might not have the same degree of personal affiliation. And then I think lastly, Lynn, I've shared with you before some of the photos and evidence that we've seen. Early on, I'll give an example, an arrest warrant from the Taliban, that was deemed as being compelling and credible evidence. And you get the impression now that they're kind of shooting these things out of confetti, cans, i.e. almost everyone who comes to you has one. So then you need to think about, how do I thoughtfully then disaggregate between the risk of this person who says they're on an arrest list versus the risk of this person that says they're on an arrest list. And so I think the final thing is you're never going to have a complete picture, because there are circumstances about interpersonal risk that will just never come to the surface in terms of evidence or documentation people can provide. It's cultural, it's contextual. And so the best thing I think that you can try to do is look for things that are consistent with your understanding that you have seen time and time again across cases that would suggest this person is at risk. Seek input from as diverse range of stakeholders who have that local and specific expertise as you do. And then when you're conducting your, intake interviews and assessment interviews, I think you look for the information provided through translators, because we always use translators to be consistent with what was shared previously.
Well, as you say, you're dependent on the goodness of other people who are supporting the work that you are doing, funders, for instance. Have you noticed since Ukraine was invaded by Russia in, nearly 2 years ago now, February 2022, and since the outbreak of war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas over Gaza, do you see that this causes more pressure for you in terms of resources and the number of people that you're able to help?
Absolutely. But Lynn, I wonder, is it caused by these certain events and sort of donor attention and appetite having to go somewhere else? Because there are finite resources for this type of work. It's never going to be an unlimited pool, and the more needs there are, the more that's dispersed. Or is it the fact that 2.5 years into the crisis in Afghanistan, most donors don't view this as being an emergency situation anymore? This has therefore become the status quo for Afghanistan. And, the question we would all ask ourselves is, what level of support would we expect to be sustainable over the long term? Because if you actually compare Afghanistan to other global refugee crises, like the speed at which people got rightfully access to referrals, and I say that was the right and moral thing to do, and we're obviously very involved in advocacy for more funding and more visa resettlement, is unprecedented. The average refugee journey is something like 8 to 12 years. People are living in absolutely deplorable conditions, whether that's on the US-Mexico border, I know, hot topic, or a refugee camp in Africa being host to the world's largest population of refugees. So I think one of the things that I try to provide some context around to people is, while yes, more funding, more attention, more advocacy, all of these things are needed. I'm not sure, again, how much of the clawback is caused by these other issues and conflicts. I suspect some, but I think there's also, people determining that there was a short-term emergency, and even though the circumstances in Afghanistan hasn't changed, it's just no longer being classified that way.
Mm, mm. Yes, and therein a problem. I think if a situation is allowed to prevail, no matter how horrific it is, as it has been in Afghanistan, then it becomes the norm, and interest in it as an emergency is also diminished. And I agree with you that that has certainly happened over the past 2+ years since the Taliban retook control. But let's move away from that and look at you. What does an average day in your life look like, Laura?
Yeah, so I do have a full-time job outside of Task Force Next, which we very briefly alluded to. I often wake up to, I can't even count how many messages that I would get on the various messaging platforms, mainly Signal, because that's more secure, but also WhatsApp. We get a lot of increasingly desperate emails to our email inbox. And, I think up until this autumn, we did have grants available through donors where we were very consistently reaching out and responding to people. We were able to process micro protection grants, a program we're very proud of because we thought it met a unique and niche need, while also not, incentivizing people to make decisions that might otherwise make them more vulnerable. That's been a very key part of who we are. So at present, I'm no longer triaging all of these substantial inbounds, but I am looking for the families to whom we have made a commitment to make sure that there's nothing that they need from me in terms of paperwork or documentation to move their third country referrals forward, to see how they're doing funding wise, but also really importantly to understand kind of how they're coping from a mental health and resilience perspective. I mean, 2.5 years is a long time to be waiting. And that certainly does take a toll, particularly for people who have endured, violence at the hands of the Taliban or prolonged detentions. So typically I would spend about, 30 minutes to an hour doing that in the morning, Lynn. Quickly, mobilize, jump in, make my kids breakfast, get them off to school, get into the office. During the day, I'm responding to emails, responding to messages. If there is something that is time critical, I have to find a way to get it done. I think one of the differences between this work in Afghanistan versus the prior refugee work that I did on a more programmatic level is it literally is life and death. And so you can very much find it difficult to balance this with your other professional and personal responsibilities. It can become, and has for me certainly been, something that has been all consuming, at great personal cost to me. And so I think, it it's been something that I've been exceptionally grateful to have had the opportunity to be involved in, but in a very, very different way to any of my other volunteer work. It has certainly come at what I would say is a pretty profound cost.
Well, when you say that, you refer earlier to the mental health impact on the people that you are trying to help, but there's the mental health impact on you and your family, of the stress and the complexity of the work that you're doing. Is it asking too much to ask you to tell me how you cope with that?
Oh, I'm happy to share. I mean, I think the first thing that I've seen in my life is certainly your sort of past traumas and challenges can often give you tools and resources that you can delve into in the current moment of difficulty or crisis. And so, a bit of personal context, I briefly alluded to the fact that one of my children is severely autistic. Um, and for anyone who knows and loves somebody with autism, you will have an understanding of, what that will mean for our family life and for life on a day-to-day basis. The second thing is my fourth daughter was born during COVID quite prematurely in an emergency situation. Um, and so I think those two things have given me a bit more resolve, and resilience than I might have had otherwise. But I really think I have been fortunate to have a good support system, both through Task Force Next co-founder Sarah, and I have a great friend here in the UK who's also actively involved in this work, Sarah Finby Dixon, who just act as a sounding board for me. My husband sacrificed tremendously for 2 years, stepping up, taking on family responsibilities, taking care of the kids. And while my children are generally too young to understand it, they also sacrificed significantly, because every possible spare moment I was on my emails or on calls. I would miss out on weekend family trips to the park. I literally spent probably 2 years literally working all the time. And while I feel, that was the right thing to do because I was in a position to help, there is guilt with that, Lynn. Like, I have not been a great mom. I have certainly not. I mean, you will know have been impossible to get a hold of, to get to respond to messages. A lot of my friends sort of joke with me, like, where have you been? And so for me, it's also come at, a recognition that I have sacrificed things that I care about because you can only do so much. Conversely, there are other volunteers in the volunteer community. My friend Kate in the United States did a lot of work on volunteer resilience, and people donated to their financial detriment. People lost houses, people lost jobs, marriages ended, people resorted to self-harm. And so
Mm,
I think, you know, it's not easy when the circumstances and the impact of not engaging, are so serious and are
mm.
so dire. But then also the complexity of the types of issues that you're facing with. Most people, wouldn't never ever have that type of frontline trauma front and center in front of them. I mean, we are often the first call somebody makes when they've been released from Taliban detention. Not you, Lynne, I wasn't your first call, but, some of our friends in Afghanistan, that's certainly the case. And we get a detailed firsthand account of the torture that they have endured. We understand how much they have suffered. And, that is not an easy burden to carry. But equally, I feel it is such an honor that people feel able to share some of the most painful parts of their story with us. And we do truly treasure those friendships with the women and hope that even just through the simple act of listening and standing with them in solidarity in their moments of crisis, that gives meaning to them and also lets them know that their stories and the tireless work they're doing, often which seems to fall on deaf ears, is valuable and respected by us.
Well, Laura, I think that they're lucky to have you. What do you think has made the biggest difference to your work?
I think your reputation matters, Lynne. And I think because we have been thoughtful and we have sought to uphold values at sort of every step of the journey, it is a small network of people who are involved in this work. And being able to be recommended to others in the network has been kind of the key to unlocking our access to both sort of institutional style grants and funding, but ultimately some of the referrals for resettlement. But that, I think that stems from our experience with this other organization. Some examples I will give is, there certainly are organizations that have, less so to an extent now, given the government of Pakistan's current position and posturing towards Afghans, but they would move people out of Afghanistan into Pakistan who didn't have passports. And, I understand that these people were at risk. I understand the Taliban were hunting for them. But if you look at the international definition of human trafficking, like technically there's an argument to be made that moving people across an international boundary without official travel documents is trafficking. And so that's just not something that, no matter how extreme the circumstances are, that was not something that we as an organization would do. I also think people have appreciated our honesty and candor. If we aren't able to verify a case or, we simply don't know, we're very happy to be honest and upfront with, both partners and the families that we support. We know very much what our swim lane is, what our experience is, what we and our team in Afghanistan can do safely and effectively. And that's very much kind of what we stick to.
You said earlier that you've been involved in helping about 300 people. That includes families to leave the dangers and the vulnerabilities that they were facing in Afghanistan. Overall, you're not the only person working in this space, obviously, and your task force NICS is quite small. How many people do you think have been helped? Are you able to make any sort of guesstimate at numbers of people who've been helped by people like you, unsung volunteers who are really making yourself vulnerable and your families vulnerable by, out of the goodness of your heart, helping people who need help?
Well, I think the difficulty in that question is all numbers don't convey the same information, Lynne. And something that we really haven't talked about is when Task Force NICS reports a number, it's where we think that we can substantiate that we had a materially leading role in the ultimate evacuation and resettlement. This isn't a family who contacted us and later sent us some pictures once they arrived in Spain. This isn't a family that contacted us and we sent them $200 one time. Because certainly there are many, many cases that would sort of fit in those parameters that would exceed by far hundreds. In this space, there's organizations that focus on advocacy, and while we're involved, that's kind of not our key remit. But we have done what I often call the unseen and forgotten work of actual case management, and I think that is why we have managed to get resettlement for people who otherwise were ineligible for programs, and that is a really key message. There are incredible organizations and incredible volunteers who are helping people access existing programs they are eligible for. And then there are people like Sarah and I at Task Force NICS and a small other number of volunteers who are saying, this family is at risk. They would meet a UNHCR definition of a refugee. We are going to literally spend, an average case would probably take us 100 hours. We're conducting 5 to 6 interviews through translators. I will review every single photo they take me. I will get documentation on where it took place, what date it took place. And then when we create their risk statements, Lynn, I've not shared many of these with you. Some of them are between 20 to 30 pages long of the statement alone. And we would include embedded hyperlinks in the document, linking it directly to the evidence. And essentially, the reason we've taken this approach is it should be unquestionable to anyone reading the statement that one, this person has a strong and clear history of human rights. They're substantially at risk. We've provided compelling and extensive evidence, direct threat evidence, in a way that is very easy to access. Not only that, but we also, for these families, have been responsible for their full funding. I had mentioned earlier on that, people were responding very early on to this crisis, moving hundreds of people into Pakistan with the understanding that, they were going to be eligible for these programs, or maybe the timeline would be 6 months or less. And I think our experience spoke to the fact that the refugee journey is longer than that. And so we have only taken on families where we felt we could fundraise to them for the duration. We had assumed that was a period of 2+ years. And I think that thoughtful approach has been, really important, but also just providing you the context of, I probably couldn't compare our numbers to others because one, what I'm saying is a little bit different to how I understand others report their numbers. But I think certainly you could look at the US-based Afghan evac coalition. I mean, I don't know how many member organizations they have at present. At some time, it was over 60, 70, 80. Those are comprised of both paid employees and also volunteers. I would say at present, there's, probably upwards of 1,000 volunteers still operating in the space on a pretty consistent basis.
So the thoroughness of the work that you are doing is essentially to demonstrate and justify your judgment that the people that you are trying to help should be helped, even though they might fall through the cracks or not fit within the very strictly defined parameters of other organisations. That's basically what you're saying, isn't it? And so, 20 to 30 pages of a case file is filled with your own justification, which takes you hundreds of hours to do.
Yeah, and I think there's two points that I want to make to that, Lynn, is that the way in which a lot of the Afghanistan resettlement refugee programs have been set up, I mean, they are, if I'm being generous, a best attempt by a government to put, discrete and finite parameters for a certain population of people. But often it's arbitrary, like you would see people who are eligible for UK ARAP because they worked for a private sector contractor and were deployed on one project versus the other. So there's also an element of, I hate to say the word luck, but that is true. Like if you happen to work on the right project for the right amount of time, or have a supervisor who's willing to write you, then you can access, some of these programs. There were attempts set up. So, Spain, France, and Germany, and allegedly the UK, but we really haven't seen that bear fruit. And Canada set up other more generic programs for at-risk Afghans. But again, the criteria and the accessibility of those programs depend on very much on your relationships. Do you have access to kind of authorized referrers or NGOs that are operating alongside with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? And again, what we've seen time and time again is the level of work we are willing to put in is a key differentiator and determination of people's ultimate referral for resettlement. I do want to say that was true up until early this year. But by and large, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, a lot of these programs have met quotas. A lot of them are closed. It's unclear if there will be further capacity for eligible at-risk Afghans. And so there is this need for continued advocacy and pressure on governments to continue to prioritize those who are placing their lives at risk, upholding the values of women's rights and human rights and democracy in Afghanistan.
Mm. Well, we'll get on to women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan in a moment, but I just want another personal question for you is, Laura, what's been the best part of this work for you, and what's been the most challenging part of this work for you?
Honestly, it's relationships with people I've met that would be both the best and possibly the most challenging, Lynn. Their Task Force Nix is a women-founded organization, and while certainly that wasn't necessarily by design, I think it's often women who care most about women's issues and particularly women's rights being rolled back. Again, certain exceptions certainly abound. Um, and I've developed really deep friendships with a number of really remarkable, incredible women who've been with me at every step of the way, and other women who have stepped in to provide support where they can. Our friendship certainly wouldn't have taken place without this work, Lynn, and that's something I'm certainly grateful for. Um, and I think those will endure beyond the crisis in Afghanistan or whatever comes next in this next chapter, because I definitely see in a similar way to there was a stage transition between the early evacuation efforts with the airplanes in the airport to stage two evacuation where programs were accessible, funding was available. We're kind of now entering this stage three where the future pathway is unclear and further work is required there. Equally, and before I go on, some of the families themselves, I love them.
Mm.
We have several families in Canada who are just very kind and generous and just that they really have developed a care for who you are and your family. I also have a friend in Italy who also I will probably see this person once, if not twice, this year. So a very deep and meaningful friendship. Conversely, anyone who has interacted on a close and prolonged basis with survivors of extreme trauma can actually understand that it is not uncommon that those who've been abused can also exert abusive behavior, even towards those who are trying to assist them. Um, and while you can have this sort of intellectual understanding, it can be very difficult for you in light of the fact that kind of what you're doing is done as a volunteer, in light of the substantial amount of time that I've just communicated to you, Lynn, that you invest at great sacrifice to yourself, to be faced with what would probably be classified as abusive behavior and trying to help the individuals engaging in that activity to sort of course correct in a way that's more in line with our organization's sort of code of conduct and respect. Um, I mean, some of the messages that I have received, I will paraphrase in case, out of respect and caution for the people who sent them, would be, you are an awful, horrible woman. Because you haven't helped me, I'm going to commit suicide. Or my children are starving. It is your fault. They will die.
Mm.
And those are probably the ones that are even less of a personal attack. So I think that has certainly been more difficult, both from a motivation perspective, but also from a mental health perspective. And I think certainly that very much played a part and had a big impact on people that I work with that I care very, very deeply about. And that is very unfortunate, regrettable, and in my opinion, no amount of trauma absolves you of your responsibility to treat other human beings with a basic level of dignity and respect, particularly those who are doing so much to try to assist you in your circumstances.
Mm. Yeah. Um, your compassion is coming through with every word that you say, Laura. Um, let's finish off with a discussion about women's rights, the direction that it's been going in Afghanistan since the Taliban retook control. I mean, there's been an awful lot of retrograde discussion about the situation in Afghanistan, if you like, as if suddenly on the 15th of August it became an awful place for women's rights and human rights. But it was consistently regarded as the worst place or one of the worst places in the world to be born a woman. There was still a very, very long way to go. And I can understand the way the narrative has change to try and make it out as being terrible because of the Taliban. I think it is probably worse because of the Taliban, but I don't see it getting better because what the Taliban are doing, which is essentially abusing the fundamental rights of more than half of the population, they are getting away with. And this impunity is feeding in on itself and making things worse. We're getting away with it. So, like children, we'll just see how much further we can push that envelope. You're working right on the front line there, Laura, with people who are experiencing detention, abuse, torture, desperation to leave, improve the lives of themselves, their families. How do you what's your how do you frame it? Do you see things getting better? Is it getting worse? Where's it going? Why is it being allowed to? Why is the situation being allowed to prevail?
Yeah, so I think really important context for all of us listening today is that women's rights in Afghanistan um, historically have actually kept pace to an extent with the West. And by that, I mean, it was, I think, 1919, Lynn, when Afghan women first won the right to vote. That was a year before the United States. And if you look at kind of other European countries, it was roughly in line. In 1964, women's rights were enshrined in the Constitution. And so there was a lot of early modernization and progress that had been taking place that really got reversed through the Soviet regime, through the first coming of the Taliban. And so in 2001, here we are, yay, we're coming back, we're going to lead the charge. And a lot of the rhetoric, I remember it so clearly growing up. I was in a community college class on 9/11, and I remember immediately the rhetoric was like, we're doing this for the women, these
Yeah.
poor women, they're being oppressed, and here's all of this. And for 20 years, we had all of these lovely little programs where
Well,
we
lovely
were
big
quite
programs,
yeah,
lovely,
we were
very expensive programs. Yep.
yeah, but we were really happy to feature Afghan women on sort of on the front of these brochures. But clearly, that was all well and good when that was, a relatively easier thing to do, right? The Taliban was more controlling localized areas of Afghanistan during that time. We, could blow our trumpets and feel, really, really good about the work that we were doing. But I think if you look at Doha, one of the biggest problems is we kind of showed our cards and that we lost a lot of our leverage over the Taliban. And I think, as you have done with the parenting analogy, the problem is as soon as you lose it, it is a hard won battle to get back. And this is probably where I think some of these other points of conflict that you referenced, Lynn, with Ukraine, with what's happening, tragically happening in Gaza and the Middle East at the moment, is we are not probably willing to exert the diplomatic leverage and make the diplomatic sacrifices that would be required to hold the Taliban to greater account. So, in my opinion, what does that mean? I'm not in these meetings behind closed doors. Certainly I would always be advocating for sort of more pressure, more diplomacy, and more consequences for the Taliban not upholding the values that they said from the outset. But equally, I think, we need to find ways in which that we are supporting and mobilizing these organizations in country, which are Afghan led. Because I think for change to truly happen, it's honestly going to have to be a huge upswell from the ground up. It has to be something that, universally across the country, there is a need for, there is a recognition for, it is owned, it is led by the Afghans themselves, complemented with sort of this international diplomacy and public pressure. I think in the absence of both of those, the journey to women's rights in Afghanistan is going to be hard. But I think importantly, we have to remember that in any great achievement of human rights, at the very start of it, the outcome was never certain. Most of these causes, whether it was women's suffrage in Britain or even racial rights in the United States, it seemed hopeless and pointless. And so, what I often remind our colleagues, we're very careful about suggesting that they protest. We never do that. We don't encourage that. We are here to support them. And the reason for that is we as people who are safe, our families are safe, are not the ones to make encouragement or determination about activities that could put someone at risk. That is something, that they can only make for themselves. But I do note that and observe that the act of protest in itself is valuable, because what they are doing is saying, no matter if you take away my right to education, my right to work, you're telling me I have to cover myself. You literally cannot take away my right to choose to resist. And that is so, I think, fundamentally important. It continues to keep the narrative in a small way. I think international media attention has certainly moved on, but certainly to some extent, it's keeping it in the international discourse, in the international attention, where they're not just stepping back and allowing the Taliban to roll back their women's rights and the decades of progress that they had made with impunity silently. And then I think also speaking to that idea of like local and national change, that's not going to happen if these women are just stepping aside. There are alternative strategies that I'm aware of. I have heard, but we don't have experience with this, Lynne, that, people are having sort of closed door, Afghans are having closed door and soft diplomacy meetings with the Taliban. I haven't seen any change. So I would say jury's out on the impact of that strategy. But my impression would be that this will be a very long and hard-won battle. But I am optimistic that change will eventually come, but only, with that ground up and top down approach.
Yes, never give up. And whereas you say you don't see any change from apparent diplomatic efforts, the only change I see is for the worse. So we can only hope that Afghan women don't give up and that they continue to resist in a way that hopefully in the future makes a difference.
Yeah, and you and I have spoken about this too, Lynne. It cannot just be the Afghan women themselves. Like there needs to be, and there have been isolated cases certainly of Afghan men standing up for women's rights to education, and they too have paid a substantial price. But this is going to have to be something that transcends gender, transcends society, transcends socioeconomic classes. And one thing I was actually wondering today is, if you actually look at the timing of women's suffrage in the West, a lot of that coincided around World War I, where women actually had to step up and fill these really key economic roles and leadership roles to sort of keep society moving forward. And what impact that might have had, which we won't benefit from in the context of Afghanistan necessarily, or that I don't, easily see a prediction that we would have. Because I do think you see, from a research perspective, the data would also say is once you have economic empowerment, that can often lead to more social mobility, political engagement, all of these sorts of things. So one thing we should be keeping in mind with our limited donor funds and programs is how can those best be deployed to promote the economic empowerment and freedom of Afghan women.
Laura Deitz, thank you.
Thanks very much.
That was Laura Deitz, a truly good human. She talked about her work helping vulnerable Afghan women to get out of the country for their own safety, more than 300 since the collapse of the Republic. And she talked about the impact that doing this work on a totally volunteer basis has had on her personally and on her family. It hasn't been easy, she said, but her dedication is evident. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Until next time, I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Bye-bye.